Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome to MBR Live. This is a talk series given by experts, but aimed at the general public. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm Elsa, one of the founders of the magazine, the Morocco Bound Review, which has existed since January of this year, but we've just released our first print edition, which is available online at our website, moroccoboundreview.co.uk. Our articles cover think pieces and international affairs, as well as book reviews, one of which is Oliver's review, who will be facilitating this talk of the case for degrowth.
I'm Lucy, the other founder. So our first talk was back in April, I think, and it was about Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, which was given by Lou Monroy Santander in Bogota. And the last one we did last month was about Hegel's Theory of Civil Society by Dan Mendez in Boston University. So quite a range of topics. And if you missed them, they're both available on our YouTube channel, which is Morocco Bound Review. And thanks again to everyone who attended, some of whom I can see here for their really thoughtful questions.
Yeah, on that note, this is being recorded, as I've said, so it's really, really nice to be able to see people's faces. But if you want to stay anonymous, then keep your camera off. And also, if there are any technical issues during the talk, then I will put a little message in the chat to ask people to turn their cameras off.
And we'll open to audience questions after Professor Kallis's presentation. And then the talk will wrap up very promptly at 8 for various regions. So we apologise in advance if we don't manage to get through everyone's questions. But now over to Oliver.
Thank you very much. I've got the pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Giorgos Kallis, a leading interdisciplinary researcher in ecological economics and political ecology at the Catalan Institute for Research and Advanced Studies. And if it doesn't embarrass him too much, I just want to say that your kind of route into this area is very interesting, I think. He holds a chemistry degree from Imperial College, a master's degree in environmental engineering, a PhD in environmental policy, and then a second master's degree in economic analysis. And he's worked on various projects with the European Union and is the author of many articles and several books, the most recent of which is The Case for Degrowth, written alongside 3 co-authors. Giorgos is one of the main proponents of this idea of degrowth, which holds up compound economic growth is both undesirable and biophysically unsustainable. I won't say very much more about that myself, but I do want to thank Giorgos especially for being with us here tonight. I know that one of your proposals in the book for degrowth is to reduce working hours and resist academic pressure, and you're willingly giving up your time to teach us about something very important. So thank you very much. And that's enough from me. At the end, we know there'll be time for questions. And now I'll hand it over to Giorgos.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for willing to review our book and for giving me the opportunity to share some of the ideas with more people. Always happy to do so. So I want to start a little bit from the current moment, which is a little bit after than when the book started. The book starts with a pandemic. Let's say things have changed a lot the last 1 year, right? And the last 2 years. And you know, even a book that was written 2 years ago, we were struggling to keep in pace with what was going on. So we wrote an introduction, a preface, which was about the pandemic. But now, you know, we're translated in Spanish, and I'm reading it and I'm saying, like, you know, if we translate it, we have to update it because, like, the pandemic, so many things happened within 2 years. So we're writing at the very beginning there in the, I think, month 2 of the pandemic was the preface. But I want to say a little bit where we stand also in terms of a main preoccupation of those of us who work on degrowth. And it's also a key theme in the book, which is climate change and generally environmental breakdown, planetary breakdown, we might call it. And I think the last few months have started shocking even those of us who were aware about the problem, those of us who have been working on that, who have been activists in trying to stop climate breakdown, those who have been screaming and struggling for years, and for the scientists who have been studying these issues. the last events, the last heat waves in the Western US, the fires in Siberia, the extreme floods in Europe, it's not just that they are extreme events that might or might not be because of climate change. That was the motto up to recently, no? There seems to be a pattern, and there seems to be a pattern of, having 1 in 1,000-year events every 2 or 3 years right now, in many different parts of the world. And scientists have started saying that perhaps in their effort of not being too alarmist, which is something I have criticized scientists being like too alarmist and depoliticizing in a way, but in a way we found out now that perhaps they weren't alarmist enough because they have overlooked, or they tried not to speculate on the positive feedbacks that climate change might bring and heating. And it seems that we might be out for a cascade of effects that could be worse than what has been predicted, which is pretty bad to begin with. That's a moment of realization. It's a moment of harsh realization, even for someone like me. I started now reading books that they are even more radical than where I am. I started reading Andreas Malm's book, which is How to Blow Oil Pipe. It's a sensational title, but the point of the book is like, we really have to stop this oil machine. It's no longer about discussing what are the alternatives and in how many 20 or 30 years or 50 years we're going to move towards these alternatives, and carbon net zero carbon emissions, which is the talk of the day today. So right now, if we start from the current moment, which is like 1 or 2 years after our book we wrote, but which makes even more urgent the message of the book, we really have to stop. We really have, I use this metaphor in another book I wrote about limits, which is Walter Benjamin's famous phrase that a revolution might not be the locomotive of history, but it's like pulling the emergency brake. So we have to pull the emergency brake in some way. And we really have to do it now. It's not about 2050 or 2100. No, it's like any more oil being extracted from the ground is like killing our planet and basically foreclosing the opportunities of our future in a dramatic way. And we're not talking about like stopping extracting oil, which is difficult as it is now because our economy is based on oil. We're talking at least to stop like investing in oil, or at least stop opening new projects. But even none of these things have stopped. So the question here is, how do we stop? The question that we in the degrowth community more engage with is like, if we stop, if we seriously stop, if we take seriously the promise that we have to stop, how does the economy adapt to this stop, given that it's an economy that is basically run on fossil fuels? The blood of the current industrial capitalist economy is fossil fuels, is oil and coal and natural gas. So how does the economy adapt? If you want to take a parallel from the pandemic crisis, it's like once you do the lockdown, how does the economy adapt to this lockdown? Obviously, the economy will have to go, some sectors go in hibernation, others stop, and the overall economy has to continue somehow functioning. Otherwise, we all go hungry and we don't have water. Like something, the state has to organize a process of reorganization, we might call it. It's very different from the process of management of the economy that most economists have in mind, which is always expansionary. It's always the future is going to be better. It's like, how can we pour more money to create more things, to sell more things? It's a very different challenge, the one of our times, which is like, how do we stop the machine? Many metaphors have been used, I like one by Herman Daly's, like how do we repair the helicopter that is falling along the route, it's something like that. So how do we do that? And this is the questions we try to give with when we talk about the growth. How do we do that? How do that in terms of economy, but like how can society and politics be organized in this direction? Now, our idea is not the dominant one. The dominant one right now within the green circles is the one of so-called green growth or the green economy. Is the idea that we have to invest as much as possible. This is what capitalism does well, which is to invest on green technologies or renewable energies, heat insulation, you name it, different things through the markets. For some socialists, it's not through the markets, but mainly through the state. But that's a political difference. The technical idea of how do we solve this problem is like investment, development of new technologies that somehow naturally by 2030, 40, depending on how realistic you want to be, they will substitute fossil fuels and they will create a new infrastructure. And at the same time, keep the economy going as it goes and even grow, no? Let it grow more. We think this is an unlikely scenario, you know? It's a scenario of saying like, okay, for someone who is a smoker and has to stop now for health reasons, like, you know, by 2030, if you start now smoking also a little bit vapor on the way, by 2030 or 40, maybe you will smoke mostly vapor, and then it's a completely perverse logic, but that's the dominant logic right now of the system. It's like developing in parallel other things that mostly add up to, like you have windmills and you have also fossil fuels. You add up other things in the expectation that somehow by 2030 or 40, they will be the dominant one, and somehow oil will be left in the ground. Oil will not be left in the ground. Oil companies own this oil, and it's going to be a huge effect in the economy when they have to write down their assets, you know, they wipe down their assets. Oil companies will not stop doing it. And the more you develop other sources, oil will get cheaper and somewhere they will sell it now. So the question is how, from a degrowth perspective, is a deep difference with this idea of green growth, no? The difference is like, how do we stop the machine and how do we adapt in stopping the machine? The pattern with which we start the book, and the first, after the introduction, the first chapter is devoted to that, what we call sacrifices of growth, is to argue that right now, we are ready to sacrifice the future of the planet and climate in the name of growth. Call it green growth. But it's like, in order to keep it going, we are willing to take the risk of sacrificing the planet. But there is a pattern there, because also social systems, the welfare systems that in Europe were built with so much struggle and so much pain, are being sacrificed in the name of austerity or in the name of super indebtedness to keep the economy going again, to keep this 1 or 2% of the GDP growing every year. We call that the sacrifices of growth, and they are environmental sacrifices, but they're also social and economic. You saw also how governments were hard pushed to impose the lockdowns. I mean, for them to just think that they have to stop the economy even for 1 year was too hard to stomach. No, they were even contemplating of letting like a few 100,000 people dying rather than stopping the economy. I think they did stop it when they realized that there wasn't an option, that if you let people die, the economy will go down to the drain too, you know, which is very similar to what's going to happen with climate change. They don't want to stop it, and it's just going to collapse. It's just going to happen by disaster. So the question is like, we are a little bit more reasonable in saying, can we manage this transition, you know, rather than let it unfold uncontrollably and chaotically. So the book is about this transition and how it can happen. And I have to say, we are a little bit voluntaristic and utopian there, but we are trying to build a political case of what the growth could look like and how it could take place. Let me share the copy of the book cover to tell you a little bit about the spirit of the book. So the book cover symbolizes at least 3 core ideas for the book or more. First of all, it's the bicycle. It's a different technology. Ivan Illich, citing a minister of Chile in the Allende government, said socialism will only arrive in a bicycle. We might say sustainability or eco-socialism, or however you want to call it, will only arrive in a bicycle, in the sense it will have to be a transition to a slower technology and have to be like an alternative mode of doing things that it's also slower. It's more convivial. It's not just that it's cleaner, and it's also like the same industrial thing. So we start with the premise that degrowth will arrive on a bicycle now. Will be a transition to a slower and simpler mode of living, but which can be fulfilling. And that's the other aspect that is caught by this book cover now. And there is the pleasure of the bike, at least for those of us who use bikes and who are not like crazy car drivers only. We know that there is a pleasure in the bike, especially if our city permits it now. London is a little bit tough for bikers. I didn't dare to bike there. 2015 that I was there. The bikers too were too fast for my taste. And the cars too, and the trucks in the center of the city. Barcelona is much better, but it's getting better. So it's a political project to which I'll go back. The second element in in this cover, which has two dimensions, is father and child. It's care. Care and relations of care have to be central in what we call in this transition and transition to degrowth. Is where the real wealth of economies is produced, and it's also where real well-being rests. The fact that it's a father, we didn't plan all that. It happened as we did the cover, and then I reflect back on it. Now, the fact that it's a father is also interesting because it points to a cultural change that took time to happen, but has happened imperceptibly, but it's there. Of course, there is a lot to be done in terms of gender relations and in terms of more equitable sharing of care work. But there is a change. Like this photo 30 or 40 years ago, you would say is a hippie. You know, like who is a man who takes his child to school on a bike? Right now, you wouldn't say that. At least in Barcelona, you wouldn't say that, and in many other parts of the world, you know. And there's been a change, and there's been a change thanks to the struggle of the feminist movement. But there has been a struggle also. There has been a change also thanks to men reclaiming the right to have the pleasure of doing care work and spending time with their children. And that's also important if you want to think of an ecological transition. You know, that it has to be a cultural change and something that people want. The majority of fathers, I might be too good to be true, but I think that the majority of the fathers want a parental leave right now. I enjoyed having a 4 months parental leave. You know? That was not the case in my father's generation. Probably he wanted to a parental leave, but the motto at the time was the macho one, like the father doesn't stay home. This is women's job now. This is a cultural change that has happened over time, has involved a lot of political struggle. It was not straightforward. Was not given, but it has happened, and we didn't understand it exactly when it happened, but it was happening. So in our book, we really emphasize that part, which might sound a little bit out of touch with how I started, which is like we have to stop the oil pipes now, you know. Well, I'm saying that at the same time, it cannot be like the 10 of us that we want to stop the oil pipes. There has to be a cultural change where like it seems like to many families, not all families, it might seem strange now to say, oh, I'm a man, I'm not going to take care of the children. You know, that's a woman's job. That has become almost impossible to say today. You know, at the same pace, we need the cultural change where it will be impossible to say, you know, I'm just going to fly for the weekend, or I'm taking my car to go do groceries, you know, or I'm just going to use fossil fuels to just do what I'm doing. This cultural change needs to happen. So in the book, we entertain the idea of how it can happen. Now, this is not captured very much in the book cover, but it's the idea that we put forward these commons and mutual aid. It's kind of captured a little bit in the square, but we didn't like that this square are individuals working there. We wanted people sitting together or doing something in the square, which a graphic designer from Politico would find a nice picture. But that would be the ideal book cover, like a square where people are together, you know, a common space that is used in common, which means by people coming together. So a core idea of the book is that to build these new sensibilities and this new culture, the commons and the new economies of cooperatives or mutual aid are the fundamental niche or the fundamental breeding ground for these new sensibilities and this new culture. Now, for this new culture to be generalized and not remain like the privilege of lucky, advantaged few, you know, that we have the capacity or the education or the freedom, if you want, financial, to engage in this parallel economy of the commons. In order for this to be generalized, there has to be political struggle. Like in order for gender relations to change, there had to be the struggle of the feminist movement. On the same token, for these commons to be generalized and become a part of a broader society and expand their space, there is a need for political struggle and for organized for protecting the commons and for enlarging the commons. We argue that this is like a co-evolutionary project. You need people involved in the economy of the commons in order to organize politically to defend them. And in order for the common sense, but the culture that I mentioned, of the commons and of doing things in commons and sharing and doing things in simpler forms to spread. Now, the political party is central, so you need to organize at higher levels of organization, apart from the mutual aid networks of the commons, to see change happen. And especially for climate change, we need action at the state level and the international level. Also with the pandemic, we saw that there was the importance of mutual aid between people, but there was the importance also of the state, of protecting people, no, from a calamity. Likewise, the state has to take an important force, to be an important force in the transition to what we call degrowth, and also in transitioning away from fossil fuels. So in the book, we articulate what things can be done by the state, what policies and institutional changes can be done by the state. We call for a universal care income, for reducing working hours, for a complete overhaul of the taxation system to tax carbon and resource use rather than work. We call for policies for reclaiming the commons. Did I forget anything? There are 5. I think it's these 5 policies. And for a Green New Deal, for a project of investment in the right things, you know, by the state, of pushing investment there. But you might ask, which state is going to do that? Where is the state? You know, like we have Boris Johnson in England, even you in Spain, you might have someone slightly better, but they're not going anywhere near this direction. No? And more or less, they're doing the same things, let's say. Even in the pandemic, we saw it more or less. All governments were looking one another and we're doing similar things. It's not big variation there. So how do you build the political momentum for these changes to happen? This is an act of faith, but it's also an act of organizing, as it has always been. And this is where we emphasize our co-evolutionary model. We take a little bit of hope from the city of Barcelona, and I'll finish with that. We're back in 2011, and the poster is from that, the first occupation in Europe of squares, symbolically also what we have in the cover, European City Square. Occupation of the squares, a movement built in the square for the commons, becomes a political party, goes in the elections, wins the elections of the city, and then supports the development and the protection of the commons of the city, with many problems. So I'm romanticizing a little bit here, but it is pointing to the dynamic that needs to be at stake right now. Municipalists and at higher levels, protest and confrontation, because without this nothing happens. Protest and confrontation that creates new sensibilities, that they get a political expression, and then this political expression changes the institutions and lets these sensibilities flourish even more. That's how we build the case for degrowth. Now, if you want to ask me things about why degrowth, why not growth, why not GDP growth, why not an alternative indicator, we have some 30 questions like that that we have encountered throughout the years, and it's the end of the book. It's the frequently asked questions. The acronym is a bad word, but sometimes that's the feeling you get when you receive the same questions over and over. We have these also there, but I didn't want to talk about them so much because I don't want to present like the standard case for degrowth, why economic growth cannot continue, why there are limits, why is it catastrophic, etc., etc. You may want to ask me about that if that's what triggered you. But I wanted more to say like a little bit, okay, what's the political idea behind this book? Because that book is the last in a long list of books we've written. I've written a much bigger, more kind of academic book on degrowth, published in 2018. In 2014, we made a big edited volume where we collected all the voices around degrowth to write something about it. In this book, we wanted to be like, how do you do that? How do you do that? That was the question we tried to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to move on to the question and answer session. So the way this is going to work is, what you can do is you can raise your hand virtually. So you'll see there's a reactions button at the bottom of your screen. And if you raise your hand, we can call out your name and you can unmute your microphone and ask a question.
Oliver, I can get, if there are too many questions at some point, I can get 2 questions at a time or 3, you know, like to speed it up so that everyone asks a question, okay?
Perfect.
But I can start one by one and we see.
Okay. Okay, so it looks like we've got a question here from Margaret Hopkins. Margaret, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Yes.
Okay, so it looks like we've got a question here from Margaret Hopkins. Margaret, are you there?
Yes.
So if you just want to unmute your microphone, then you can ask a question.
I've pressed unmute. Can you?
We can. Try again. You've gone back to mute. Try unmuting again. Good.
Okay. I like the idea of degrowth, but on the other hand, it seems to me very unpractical. I don't know how one can get the idea over to people to what they do. Just thinking of a very simple thing. If you believe in it and you want to do something about it, what do you do about cleaning your teeth in the morning, for instance? You know, everybody uses masses of toothpaste and toothbrushes or an electric toothbrush. Well, if we've got degrowth, we can't go on cleaning our teeth in quite the same way. I mean, this would apply to sort of just about everything, but to try to convince people that they've got to change their way of life is very difficult. How do we do it?
Yeah, that's a good question, Margaret. It's very difficult. Now, what we have to change and how much, I mean, remains to be seen. I don't know if we would have not to use toothbrush and toothpaste. Perhaps not electric, we'll see. I mean, my colleague Julia Steinberger has a great paper, which is, they've done some calculations on 9 billion people getting a decent amount of energy, everyone, what would that entail, you know, and with 20% of the energy that's currently used globally. And they find that this is feasible. Of course, you need smaller houses. So people who have like huge houses need smaller houses. You can't use cars. You can use only public transportation. So there are definitely changes that they are difficult, but I don't know if if it's gonna go as far as prohibiting toothbrushes. I hope no. So how do you do these changes? They're very difficult, yes, they're very difficult, but they do happen. We had changes overnight with the pandemic, many of them unpleasant. They were unpleasant because it was crucial to have social distancing, which is precisely the opposite of what we would like to see under degrowth, where we would like to see social, how do you say? What's the opposite of distancing? Whatever it is, that's it, no? Social commoning or social coming together, you know? Of course, history, we can never control it or predict it. So you might have like a wave of pandemics from now onwards, coupled with climate change, which would be the worst possible scenario, right? But change does happen quickly. The question is like whether we want this change somehow through change and persuasion and through policy and through people coming together to happen in a way that it feels like welcome, or whether it will happen uncontrollably the way capitalism will do it, which is, to use your example, you know, like have a climate breakdown, like trade chains collapse, and then toothbrushes cost 30 euros and whoever can afford it affords it. That's what capitalism will do, you know. We don't want that. We don't want that. We won't be happy when this happens. So we're not ecologists who revel in the catastrophe that it's about to come. We really would like to maintain and to provide a really meaningful level of living with the necessary resources that keep us within the planetary boundaries. That's the goal. But I definitely the cultural change is not easy.
Thank you very much. So for the next question, shall we take the three at once then? Patrick, Kelly, and Jonathan. So Patrick first.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I found it very interesting, and I find the idea of degrowth very compelling. I think the point you kind of touch on of kind of this idea of, you know, we want to decouple carbon emissions with growth, and in fact this is kind of something which seems like a very risky strategy, which has never really been, we've never really done anything like that in the past, whereas we know that if we decrease our economic output, then there'll be reductions in carbon emissions. However, I think that the thing I'm most sort of skeptical about, I guess, is like, you know, people, you know, I think if we're aiming for kind of like very extreme reductions in carbon emissions, like, you know, people often talk about net zero, then does that not require a very extreme degrowth? And a kind of, when we think about, you know, sort of global, you know, how that degrowth would be distributed globally, I think a lot of people would quite reasonably say that there should still be plenty of growth in lots of parts of the world, and, you know, and perhaps Western or, you know, northern the global north can have this quite heavy degrowth, but perhaps there would be a kind of a more moderate position, which is sort of a bit of degrowth and a bit of this decoupling from technology that we haven't yet developed yet. I don't know what you think about that sort of idea.
Thank you. Shall we take another question at the same time? Are you happy to do that?
Yeah, let's take two.
Okay.
Of this one.
Kelly, you're muted.
Sorry, just to say thank you for the talk. It was really, really interesting. You mentioned cultural change, and that seemed to be quite germane to your argument. And I think this might link to what Margaret was saying earlier around behavioural change. So you did mention a number of times the notion of behaviours coming out of the feminist struggle. I couldn't quite identify that sort of frame of that feminist struggle, because a lot of the feminist struggles actually have to have work recognised and paid for and valued. And I suppose that has never actually happened, which, you know, is the argument for some. A lot of labour isn't recognised within this system. So I suppose the argument in some ways for degrowth is what would drive people who've never had access to the privilege to actually step aside and embrace a change that they've never had anyway. You know, that they've always been outside of this framework. So why would they be expected to step back and give up what they've never actually had access to or never enjoyed? Thank you.
Yeah, to the first question of Patrick, yes, you can't zero emissions by zeroing the economy, so that's not the degrowth proposal. You know? There is obviously a combination of a restructuring of the economy and changing of the technologies we use, doing energy conservation, using things more efficiently. So it's a combination of the two things. You know, let's say the less growth, the better, because if you imagine 3% growth every year means that the economy is going to be 11 times bigger by the end of the century. I mean, 3% sounds innocent, you know, but like 11 times by the end of the century is not that innocent. So, or if you want to reverse that, let's say 0% growth means that the economy in 2100 would be 11 times smaller than it would otherwise be. So you can imagine that it makes a huge difference in terms of what you have to decarbonize or what you have to clean or what you have to change. So it's a combination of the two. But again, the way I like to put it is the way I framed it a little bit at the beginning, which is not how everyone in the growth community frames it, but I framed it a little bit different, which is there a recognition that if we do what needs to be done, the economy will take a blow, and then it's like the growth is like managing this blow, managing a prosperous way down, let's say. So I can't see how we can transition out of fossil fuels without the economy taking a blow. And I think we're not transitioning out of fossil fuels, apart of course from the huge vested interests and the way capitalism works, etc. No? But there is also the generalized feeling, which is I think what you are all expressing and what Kelly expressed now, which is it is going to take a blow. So how do we move out of fossil fuels? I read somewhere that Norway, which is the wealthiest country in the world, and decided to continue extracting natural gas. They are not deciding to take a blow. I think it's really hard to imagine that we can make this transition and not take a blow. I know that there are people who argue that it is possible, but I really, really am skeptical of that. So my question, my argument is a little bit inverse. It's like, how do we manage the blow? We don't know how much it's going to be. We don't know if it's going to take toothbrushes with it or not. But we know that there is a blow that has to be managed, like smoothing a slowdown that will be inevitable if we want to go in this direction. To Kelly's question, a very strong element in our argument about the growth is redistribution and provision of public goods and commodified public goods by the state. So free public health, free education, like public goods that they are necessary for a decent mode of living are provided free to everyone. And then there is a lot of redistribution. I mean, these are very politically difficult ideas. No one's saying it's easy, but like let's see the logical part of it or the argument part, and then we can discuss for hours about the politics of it. But that's the argument. So the argument is not that you're gonna cut down the, I don't know, the NHS or the consumption of people who take the bus. You're gonna charge them more for taking bus. Like ideally, you should make bus free, you know, and everyone should be able to commute by decent public transport to their work. I mean, this is the kind of scientific or intellectual models we're creating. Now, how this happens, yes, it's quite demanding. So the idea is not to take away from those who don't have. These are the only ones that we would like to for sure support. That's why also we propose the idea of a universal care income or universal basic income. So that's also central there. Now, yes, there might be people that they might see Bezos flying to, or Branson flying to the moon and say like, yeah, why can't they do whatever they want? And you tell me I can't. No, that was also that was an understandable, but problematic also feeling during the lockdowns, no? I think this is where the hard work has to be done, you know, like to reach a collective understanding of the limitations we have to take. Again, sorry, I talk a lot about the pandemic, but it's something very vivid and recent for all of us, no? But again, in the pandemic, yes, there were many people who said, like, who are you to tell me, like, I suffer so much from everything, now you tell me on top of that, that I can't do this and that. And these are reasonable claims, I repeat, to the extent that they were done by people who really have been constrained by the current system. On the same token, we can see that the majority view during this pandemic was that we have to limit ourselves, you know. So we can take also courage from that it wasn't that 10 or 20% of people wanted lockdown and the other 80% said, I'm not wearing a mask, who are you to tell me? So there is some common sense, and this common sense can emerge also with climate change if it's cultivated. That's our hypothesis. Not only if it's cultivated, also if there are the mechanisms for people not to suffer, right? And for people to see like tangibles improvements in their lives that then make them feel like, okay, this is not against me. This is not me once again who don't have enough paying for Bezos to fly to moon, you know. But unfortunately, Bezos still flies to moon, and as long as Bezos flies to moon, yes, whatever we say, it doesn't make much sense.
So thank you. I wanted to ask a question at this point, actually, as a follow-up to what something I remembered whilst you were speaking. You were talking about this idea of common sense, which I think comes up a few times in the book. And you have this idea that to have a big change in behavior over society, you need changes in common sense. And if I read the book correctly, I think it's a valuing of living a small life. And I remember there's a phrase in the book where you say, or one of the authors has written that it's inherently valuable to live a small life. And so you give some certain examples, like Pope Francis, I think, is one example. And I thought that was interesting because it was slightly different to the argument that you were making in the book. In the book, living a kind of smaller life in which you consume less is useful because avoid or mitigate climate breakdown. But then you also say it's inherently valuable. And I was wondering if this kind of sense of it being inherently valuable and inherently kind of worthwhile and a good thing to do is a bit different to this idea of it being useful or necessary, maybe. And then I'll also take the time to maybe take a question from Jonathan, who's been waiting with his hand up for a long time, actually. So Jonathan, if you want to ask a question now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. I was just thinking about time. When I was a kid, my mum and dad, my mum didn't work, my dad did. They could afford to buy a house. They weren't especially wealthy. And that was back in the 50s, 60s. And would it not be a great advantage of degrowing that we would just get so much time back? And if you told people that rather than working 5 days a week, they could work 2.5 days a week and have that freedom to then spend their time, I don't know, brushing their teeth with other things, or making campfires, or just looking after their kids better, would that not be a compelling reason to degrowth?
Yeah, let me start with Jonathan. Yes, a very compelling one, and one that we have to do central. Perhaps, yes, as a matter of emphasis, we could start also presenting from there. It's a good point. I mean, I have to think of that. But I think it is a compelling, and it is one that may speak to people more. And I mean, it's something I've written a paper on called Friday Off, which is, it's a little bit more academic, let's say, but it's like evaluating how could taking 1 day off of the current 5-day week could work, etc. But it's definitely, yes, a core point of the growth should be that. And one of our 5, let's say, policies is that. But I take your point that it can be also the way of framing it, no? That I didn't frame it in this way. It's a strong framing, and one that can speak to many people. No? Interestingly, it can speak also across classes, no? Because the sense of lack of time is not only the working class, it's also middle class, or even people who have money. A good point also by Oliver. Yes, our point is that it's inherently valuable. I have another book that I may advertise now. It's a book I wrote 2 years ago, which is called Limits. And there I make the case for inherently, let's say, what you call the inherently valuable notion of limits, So, and I argue that main thing that the green movement has offered is that it has kept alive this idea, this ancient wisdom of limits as being something desirable in and of itself, like being a sign of maturity. This is the argument I had made in this book, where I emphasized much more this, and actually I criticized a lot the instrumental reasoning of the environmental movement, which is like limit yourself so that you avoid the future catastrophe, because then you get stuck into this narrative of how do you avoid the future catastrophe, etc. But I have to accept that it's difficult to argue within the current society without this utilitarian instrumental logic. So many times I myself fall back to that. But it's a combination of the two. I mean, the two I think are related, and maybe there is a cosmic wisdom to that, or a physical reality, which is like what is meaningful and good for us is also what is gonna sustain our survival in the long term. And doing something that feels also inherently wrong, which is like to want more and more and more, 3% every year, etc., is gonna also at some point collapse biophysically. This is not to turn it into something religious or supernatural, or religious if you want, religious in the good sense, yes, because like ethics and ethical systems were put in place, and religion codes to codify certain understandings about how the world works and how you can survive in it. The ancient Greeks that I engaged with in my book Limits, they had a feeling that they had invented money, that if they let money like accumulate with interest rate every year, they had a civil war, and then they almost killed one another. So then, they created codes and they created myths at the same time, and folk stories and all the legends you hear. It was like reminding you of the possibility of hubris, So there was an ethical wisdom corresponds to some material reality, and I think this is what's happening right now. You know, it's the planet is gonna break down, or our societies are gonna break down, precisely because we've given up on any ethical wisdom which says that a simple life is also the right life.
Well, I'll let the next two people ask questions. So we've got Lee and Alex. So Lee first.
Hello, thanks, Georgios, and the Morocco-bound review. You've covered some of what I wanted to talk about a bit, but I just wanted to expand. So I'm reading a book called The Birth of Energy by Karanu Dagger, and she argues that with the invention of energy and thermodynamics in the late 19th century, this is tied directly to work and a kind of Protestant work ethic, which then is used to put people to work both in the global north and the global south. And so she's arguing that this, and I've not finished the book, but I suspect that she's going to say we need to break this link. And it links to what Graeber argued in Bullshit Jobs, that much of the work that we do is nonsense anyway, and there's an inverted pay structure where the people who get paid the most do the most useless jobs, and we've seen that in the COVID-19. So what's your position, if you could expand on work and energy is defined itself as the ability to do work? And would you, I mean, people have said like a lower workday week. I think maybe you've mentioned UBI. How could UBI break the link between working and kind of living, if that makes sense? Thank you.
And now Alec, next.
Hello, thank you to everyone who's spoken and organised and asked questions. Yeah, I was interested, Georgios, in what you're saying about you were comparing the sort of the case for degrowth to sort of the pandemics, talking about how like overnight change.
You've muted yourself.
You muted.
I'll start again then. Yeah, you were saying about sort of comparing the case for degrowth to the pandemic, and you're saying how such a kind of radical change we've seen as possible in terms of some of the changes that would happen, yeah, more or less overnight with the pandemic. But I guess my sort of question about, or my doubt about the comparison is that in the case of the pandemic, a lot of people were able to see the sort of very immediate reality of what was happening. And so then perhaps it was a lot easier for people to sort of commit to some of those changes and indeed like sort of, you know, infringements of their freedom. But I feel like even now you see in Britain that people are either sort of too anxious to sort of get back to their normal working life to sort of, you know, ensure that their livelihoods are all secure, and like I think some people are also just like kind of flat out bored of it. So it feels like it didn't kind of last that long necessarily, at least from my perspective in England. And so I was wondering then how, whereas then for climate change, it seems that I think it's very important to have this sort of conversation about like, you know, maybe degrowth is a sort of a good idea, but it seems that in terms of convincing anyone of it on a wider scale, there's still that job of actually sort of convincing people that there is enough of a problem with climate change in the first place. And I fear that it's only when you then have, like the pandemic, such an immediate sort of sense of impending doom or like catastrophe, that then someone feels motivated in that sort of more negative sense to sort of act in that way. And then maybe the other one is then, yeah, that more positive view of saying that, as you've been saying, that is more inherently valuable. But then even then, while I get a bit annoyed at sort of over dependency on like, you know, material things and technologies, it's very hard to sort of argue that they've like brought no happiness or, you know, sort of satisfaction with one's life, or at least the feeling of that. So I was just wondering how you'd maybe solve those problems if you think they are problems.
No, yes, that's a huge issue. So yes, then the analogy breaks down. It breaks down because climate change has this sinister feature that makes it even worse, which is that you live the effects of years before, you know. So by the time you live the effects, it's not like the virus that you can try to stop it on the spot. They have happened, and then it's impossible to absorb this CO2 from the atmosphere. It is there to stay. So yes, there is a question of timing, and whether the effects of climate change will be felt in a time that it will be still time to change things in a way that will avert worst outcomes further in the future. In Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry of the Future, I think it's located in 2030, and then there is a heat wave like the one now in Canada. It's in India now, and it starts, I hope I'm not spoiling anything. No, you don't spoil the beginning of anything. No? So it starts with a hero in a heat wave where everyone boils to death. And the hero is one of the heroes of the book is one who survives, but then people are killing one another for Earth conditions because the power system has broken down. And the temperature exceeds the level that humans can tolerate. They try to go to lakes, they go to lakes and they all die there. So it's like hundreds of thousands of dead people in a province in India. That's not that far, you know, and unfortunately it's not that far. Like in Canada right now, it wasn't there, but it was approaching. Yeah, but the big question mark is, first of all, when it happens, can happen in India. How will it become something for us to act, for you to act in London or us in Barcelona, if there is not a heat wave right then here too? But if there are many heat waves like that, maybe, but it's not a direct. It's not a direct equation. There was a heat wave a few years ago in Europe that killed thousands of people, but no one connected the dots. So I guess there is a fear that these dots will not be connected, and there are many willful deniers and people who provide wrong information that they want to make sure that these dots are not connected. So I can't offer anything more optimistic there. But I think climate change will not be, it's not longer, it's less and less, and in a few years, but it won't be anymore like, oh, in 2050, you know, no, it's gonna be 100,000 people dead there, like 50,000 people dead there, you know, like, do we do something about it or not? But the question is, it might be a little bit, not late to do anything. You can always emit less carbon. It's never late to save the world, but it will be late to go back from that situation, because that will be locked in. But that's a problem. About energy and work, yeah, that sounds an interesting book, The Birth of Energy. I would like to look at that. In my previous book on Degrowth, yes, I argued that energy and fossil fuels basically substituted for human labor. So there is a direct connection there. I really like David Graeber's work. I've read almost everything, and I really liked the bullshit jobs argument. This gives a little bit more hope that we can reduce working hours even if we reduce energy use, because the counter argument there is, how are you going to reduce working hours and reduce energy use, which is going to be necessary, no? So you're going to reduce work from both sides. The hope there is that David was right in what he wrote, no? And that a lot of the work that is happening is bullshit work. It's just happening for capitalism to move money around. So if, let's say, 80% of the work is bullshit, then we can work 40% less and also reduce energy use 40% less and still do the same. Just to put some crazy numbers there. That's the hope. Now how do you do it? Yes, the universal basic income could be something to look at, the reduction of working hours, this compact of policies that we try to articulate in the book. Okay, I think I'm going to take the final two, although we are running late. I think it's Lucy and Andrew, right? Let's take them quickly, and I'll be fast too.
Okay, let's take them very quickly. Lucy, you first.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to say thanks again for the talk. But also I was just wondering if there were any particular countries or policies that have been implemented or that are doing things that give you lots of hope for the future, or any hope at all.
and Andrew next.
Thanks again. Yeah, great talk and very interesting. I was going to ask you, one thing I found slightly difficult is to understand, what exactly your motivations are for advocating degrowth, because it seems to me you have a mix of motivations, as been discussed earlier. That you sort of think that degrowth in itself is good, and then there's a whole thing about climate change, and they are different. So I think I would try to, approach them both very differently. On the climate change thing, why would it not be more sensible to say growth itself is not bad, it's the use of excessive amounts of fossil fuels and the impact on the climate which is the problem, and therefore what your objective should be is to reduce fossil fuel use to zero or whatever is needed to make the planet sustainable. And actually we don't know, you don't know, I don't know, nobody knows what that would mean for growth, because a lot of growth is not bad for the planet. If you have more people giving yoga lessons, that's a kind of growth. So I think why is it wrong to concentrate? Why would it be wrong to concentrate simply on the problem kind of growth, which is the greenhouse gases?
So I know you only have 2 minutes left. So if you come to a point where you need to leave, please feel free.
Yeah. No, because we think fossil fuels is central, so it's not the same as yoga. It's not to say yoga and fossil fuels are the same thing. We don't have like economies that they were built by people doing yoga. I mean, we had a lot of yoga and meditation in the East, but they didn't become capitalist economies that conquered the world, let's say, or Bhutan. We know that fossil fuels is like the lifeblood of the current economy. Yes, we can speculate that it could be possible to perhaps transition to renewables and at the same time grow. This is the argument of green growth. So a lot of our argumentation is that this is unlikely and that this is impossible. To me, it's like saying like, yeah, we can impose lockdowns and who knows whether the economy will not grow or grow. Maybe it grows. Yeah, of course, we can say maybe it grows, but in all likelihood, given the information we have, it won't grow and it will go down 10 or 20% the next year, You might argue that the parallel doesn't work and that there is reasons to think that the economy could grow by investing in renewables, pouring more money in the new economy, etc., etc. So I don't want to be dogmatic there, but I think it is unlikely. I think like stopping the fossil fuel machine will have a knockdown effect on the economy. I also do not see scenarios that seem to me feasible and that expect that the economy will be 11 times bigger by the end of the century and somehow magically be cleaner, not use other materials that will create other problems, not start producing an exorbitant amount of nuclear waste or whatever, Generally, I'm thinking slowing down when the train is going to towards the precipice is the more sober idea than thinking, let's go fast and we'll fix it along the way, That's a little bit my feeling with the growth. But as I said, I find that linked also to the whole, I think, and to the whole argument about that this is also a better prospect. Because if I just left it there and I told you, have to do that, it wouldn't be a very attractive proposition. You could as well tell me like, okay, let's live the way we live as much as we can, and then that's the end. Like the attractive proposition is that it's also a wiser and better way to live. Does exist and doesn't need to be only that. No, countries that you might say that they've gone this way, there aren't. Examples from different places, there are. Like there are many arguments about Costa Rica and the transition they made to invest in public goods and also in a greener economy, how it changed their economy, and they have some of the higher well-being levels in the world at a relatively lower median GDP. You might take elements from other countries, from Vietnam, from Cuba. But with all the problems, you might say, what are you talking about? Cuba people are revolting right now. Of course, yes. So there's not an ideal example to say like, but there are like elements, bits here and there. Another bit here and there is the new municipalist movement that I talked to about. Cities trying to take control of their commons and start a different path. But that's the main blow to any theory of social change, that it's about the future, that if it was here and it was happening, would be a different talk. It's more like shouting so that the boat moves a little bit. No, it's not that the boat is already moving. But what is already happening is that there are a lot of people that I think have these common senses, are struggling for these things, are living differently, have changed their lives over the time. So there is a substratum, but whether this substratum can occupy the whole, no, if you ask me, I can be very pessimist, but I don't want to offer more doom to the one you already have, But yes, on my personal thoughts, and when I read the news, and when I do the mistake to be on Twitter all the time, which is a huge mistake, then you're not getting very optimistic.
Thank you, and thank you for responding to that question as well. I know I felt like we had a bit of a choice at the start over whether or not to talk about the arguments against green growth, or whether to talk about the content of the book. And I'm really glad that we were able to talk about some of the ideas that you were proposing in this book. Shall we finish it up there then? I think lots of us have things to do. It's a Wednesday evening. So thank you very much to Giorgos. I'll pass it over to Elsa, who's going to finish us off.
Yeah, thanks Oliver for facilitating. Thanks Giorgos for a really, really interesting talk. And thank you everyone for your really, really good questions as well. The next talk will be next month. And yeah, the website is above my head if you want to get yourself a print edition of the magazine. But yeah, thank you so much, Giorgos, and let's all
go.
Thank you. Thank you. And also, yeah, Giorgos's book, The Case for Degrowth, is out, so you can buy that if you want to read more.
And it's cheap.
Yeah.
We fought for that. Thanks.
Yeah, Oliver's waving it up and down.
Thank you. Bye-bye.